Welcome to Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This episode of Leading People is brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's widecircle.eu. Leading People is a podcast which features insightful conversations with leading people about leading people. Yes, that's a play on words. In each episode, you get tips from leading people such as CEOs, HR professionals, authors, and thought leaders on all aspects of leading people, including how to attract, engage, develop, and grow talent to build successful organizations. And we provide insights on how to lead yourself so you can consistently perform at your best. In order to design and deliver effective learning and development initiatives, it's essential to understand how our brains process and retain information. My guest this week is author and learning and development expert Stella Collins. During our conversation, Stella provides insights into how our brains learn best and tips on how to improve your ability to retain and apply your learning. Please bear with the audio quality, as what Stella has to say is both very interesting and important. Stella Collins, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here with you, Jerry.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I think we met for the first time almost about a year ago, and since then I sort of digested your wonderful book, and we'll get to the book in a while. And for all our listeners out there who don't know maybe who you are, or haven't yet heard your dulcet tones, perhaps you could just, how did you get to where you are today in your career? Was there one of these epiphany moments, or was it a series of little moments that you just kept building on, and you arrived today very much in this world of neuroscience and learning and development and the combination? So maybe just for our listeners, give them a little bit of a background to who you are and how you got here.
Okay. Various epiphanies, I guess. I've always had a fascination of psychology. Even as a small child, I was always curious and asking why. My dad used to teach kids with difficulties, so I was very interested in, how do people learn things? How do our brains work? How do we process stuff? But I never wanted to be a teacher. I had no intention whatsoever of getting into the teaching world. So I kind of I did a psychology degree, went into business and worked in the IT world, which was completely different, technical programming and things like that. And then one day I was kind of just given this new role, which was technical support and training manager. And I was like, I don't want that job. I don't want to do training because I've worked in IT and all the training I'd ever seen was very long, very boring, and not something I wanted to inflict on people. But I took on a colleague who was very inspirational. She had a real kind of vision of learning being what the learners did, not what the trainers did. So she began to inspire me. And then I went along to a big conference, a learning, an HR conference. And there were lots of people in grey suits, lots of them. And I was like, this is a bit boring. But there was a pirate ship. And I thought, well, that looks more interesting. So I went and talked to the pirates, and it turned out they were experts in financial stuff, that they were using accelerated learning to train complex financial training pieces. And I just thought, well, if you can do that with finance, you can do that with IT. So I kind of explored where they were, and it really brought up all the psychology that I kind of already had. And so I kind of fell into the learning world and really, really never looked back. Just where I kind of feel happy, where I feel I can add value. And it's just so fascinating because it's just a never-ending journey of new things to discover about how to make learning really effective, really work for people. And for me, learning is, how can people grow and develop and become better for themselves? How can organisations grow? How can cultures and people globally, right? And for me, it's all about learning. So kind of falling into the pirate ship was my kind of epiphany moment, I guess.
So that's great, Stella. Now, so that was the beginning of the journey, and then the curiosity, I guess, around learning. Where did the brain start to emerge in all of this, and the whole neuroscience bit, and then leading that up to writing this book, Neuroscience for Learning and Development?
Okay, so I was doing a science psychology degree, and I actually got really involved in how do brains work. I worked on a project that was looking at the dopamine system, and managed to publish a paper. Not myself single-handedly, but we published a paper. So I had this real interest in the brain. I kept that up, and then when I began to sort of start investigating this accelerated learning and the more effective way of learning, of course, immediately all that kind of knowledge about the brain that I had and kept began to be more important. It seemed important that we're actually, as trainers, as educators, if we're messing about with people's brains, if we're trying to change them, it seemed to me important that you should understand a little bit about what was going on. You need to understand a bit about memory, you need to understand something about motivation, you need to understand how attention happens, and how that kind of long-term, movement from short to long-term memory works, and then how people actually apply what they're learning in the real place. So for me, it all comes down to the brain in the end. So I've just tried to learn more and more that I can, but also to think about how to apply it in a practical sense. So not at such a high level that people can't understand it, but apply it.
Yeah, it's always fascinated me that we have this amazing organ inside us, which is so essential. And we rarely ever you don't hear much training going on at school or teaching about how to use it. It's almost, it's there and it's a given. And yet as you'll probably start to expand upon it now, when you start to understand just some basic principles, it helps. It enlightens people, provides insights that helps them understand better how they learn themselves, how they can convey learning to other people. And let's just unpack a couple of things here as we get into the book. I guess we're going back maybe a couple of decades when you started getting interested in the neuroscience, and it's one of those fields that's evolving. One of the things that nearly everybody I've spoken to who's written a book on neuroscience or has neuroscience in the book is they really want to deal with some of the myths. So could you just, for our listeners out there, particularly around learning, so what are some of these myths that people maybe still, it's not their fault because, they get into popular culture, journalists don't check their facts, they publish stuff and people believe it. So what are some of the things that people could maybe learn about the myths of neuroscience and how could they maybe loosen up those beliefs around those myths?
So just to put it in context slightly, I use neuroscience as quite a broad definition. So there's the biology of the brain, but also there's the whole kind of psychology. Even if we start looking at artificial intelligence and how we're using that in learning. So I use neuroscience as quite a broad definition. But if we think about some of the myths that are out there, there's many. I mean, lots of people sort of may still believe that you only use 10% of your brain, and that there's all this additional brain that you can use that's just sort of sitting there waiting to be used. Well, of course, if you're only using 10% of your brain, the other 90% would have disappeared because brains are incredibly energy hungry. And our bodies just would not bother keeping a piece of our brain going that wasn't used. So we definitely use 100% of our brain all the time. You can't grow it beyond the physical confines of your skull. So there isn't an unlimited growth, but we do have an incredible number of new connections we can make. So we are, we have more potential than we perhaps use all the time. So that's one of the myths, I think. There's lots of myths around things like memory, and people sort of think, they can have photographic memories. You always see TV programs of people with photographic memories. There's no such thing as a photographic memory. And I think one of the kind of the big myth that comes up is, learning should be easy. But actually, learning isn't easy. It's a very effortful process. because our brains are so energy hungry, we need to use a lot of energy to learn. We need a lot of time to learn. There's no magic, formula that suddenly says you'll learn this and you'll never forget it again, except for really things like, very strong emotional or fear memories. But in the context of business and education, you're not teaching people to avoid a snake. You're teaching people how to, think cognitively, think strategically, to learn knowledge that's going to help them in their job. And that does take effort. It's gorgeous and joyful when you do it and you do it well, but it takes effort. And I think schools and universities and businesses are beginning to show more interest in how do we learn? How do we really learn? And how can we design that learning environment so that it supports learning? But I truly believe that we should be teaching everybody, what are the basic fundamental principles of learning and how it happens. And therefore, I would give everybody a greater opportunity to actually build, even if they get given, bad content or bad training, that would give them a fundamental opportunity to remember, to recall, to be able to transfer their learning into the workplace.
Yeah. So really, in case anybody out there is wondering, this is not just about people who convey learning, let's say trainers and people who have to commission it or design it. This is really about each one of us understanding better how our brains work and how they learn, because we are fundamentally learning machines. We're constantly learning, but then we put into these formal environments where we're learning, and yet it's almost like that kind of can hinder the learning process by putting people into these environments and said, now you're going to learn something, when actually we spend our life learning things. And today with technology, it's become easier to self-learn, hasn't it? So once again, understanding things like you've mentioned a few really interesting things there about energy and how the brain consumes energy, and of course focused effort will consume a lot of energy. So even being able to manage that, how much effort and focus you put in, and realizing when you're tired, maybe it's a time to take a break. And then you talk about potential. And I think that because we're talking about learning and development, this question comes up a lot. What is somebody's true potential? So can we maybe unpack a bit of that, particularly the potential stuff, and how the research you've done and the work you've been doing helps people better understand their potential?
It's a really interesting question, Jerry. I think we all have more potential to learn more, to adapt to change more than we can, or more than we currently do. But having said that, and I think Corona has really shown us that people can adapt to change. They can adapt very rapidly, but there's a burden that comes with that, or a cost that comes with that. That you just said that learning is effortful. If we have to learn to change, if we have to learn something new, it probably means we've used that energy that we can't then use on something else. So I think, yes, we have huge potential, but I think in order to really meet that potential, we have to have recovery time. We have to have time to reflect. And I think one of the things that often happens, particularly with kind of digital and online learning, is people just throw information at people thinking, yeah, I'll just give them this information and they'll magically learn it and it'll stick. But actually, that's really not the case. So I think the idea of giving people time to really reflect on what they've learned and guided reflection or self-reflection can be really good. But one of the most important things is that we get enough sleep, because it's actually when we sleep that we really actually embed what we've learned during the day. We really embed that into our long-term memory and are able to reuse it the next day. And there's two elements of sleep. There's the kind of the change from short-term to long-term memory. But then there's also when we sleep, we actually practice our skills. When you're dreaming, your brain is equally active as if you were awake, but your body is paralyzed. But your brain is performing all the functions it would do if you were learning to play the guitar, play the bike, ride a bike. our brain is performing all those activities for us, which is why I was talking to a colleague the other day who plays the drums, and he said he quite often practices the drums in the evening because he's found that he'll be practicing a few sort of complicated moves, and he just can't quite get it, so he goes off to bed. And when he wakes up in the morning, it's there. He's got it. And it's his brain has worked on that for him overnight. So I think, sleep is one of the big myths that you really, really need sleep in order to learn.
In the next part of our conversation, Stella continues to provide us with insights on how to improve our ability to not only learn, but to retain the learning and put it into practice. She explains why the age-old practice of students cramming for exams is not a good idea, and how a leader's brain is just the same as everyone else's when it comes to learning new things. So okay, so you're touching on the area of giving a tip there. What other types of tips have you come across, or just things that you've noticed that people do around this idea of going to bed, getting a good night's sleep, and rehearsing, maybe mental rehearsal, etc. What sorts of things have you found seem to be working for people? So your drummer, that's a great example. I'm kind of smiling because I could give you lots of other examples for myself, but it's not about me. So just a few more things that you can share out there about the importance of getting a good night's sleep, but also how to use your sleep more strategically in terms of supporting your learning.
So you can't learn whilst you sleep, in terms of you can't take information in whilst you sleep. So no point thinking you can listen to a language tape overnight and wake up being able to speak Spanish or Dutch or whatever it is you want to be able to speak. But what you can do is make sure that you get sufficient sleep to allow you to embed memory. So you don't want to be cramming information late at night. And cramming is, I've been talking to a lot of students recently, and they've got exams coming up, and they're really cramming. They're kind of staying up late, and they're losing sleep. But one of the other things is they're kind of trying to do what's called mass repetition. They're trying to learn a lot in a small space of time, and that's not working for them because they're not putting gaps. And what people really need to do is, if you have to learn 3 topics, for instance, what's much more practical than learning all of A and all of B and all of C, and then realising you've forgotten A, it's better to learn a little bit of A, a little bit of B, a little bit of C, take a break, a little bit of A, a little bit of C, a little bit of B, a little bit of C. It doesn't really matter which order you do it, but to learn it in small pieces and keep coming back to it and repeating it rather than just desperately trying to cram. And I think one of the key things that I've heard a lot of people, students and people we're training at the moment, is people have this really strong belief that they kind of recognise they've learned something, and then they go back and check their notes and they kind of recognise it. They go, yeah, I've learned that. I can see that. I know that, and they can recognise it. But what they can't do is recall it. So if you ask them a question, what were the 6 steps to a process that they say they recognise? They say I've learned it, but often can't. They might get the first one, they might get the last one, and the ones in between go missing. So this difference between recognising information and being able to recall it is really key for people to realise they need to ask themselves questions. They need to be tested in order to really embed something in their memory.
So they haven't operationalised the learning or the knowledge they've brought in.
Yeah, you have to actually put it into practice in some way.
Yeah. And there are lots of nice little reference points out there anyway. I mean, one reference point is if you're learning music and you're learning an instrument, the classic advice has always been small amounts of practice regularly will build the capability. And, you'll make mistakes at the beginning and you'll make less mistakes if you keep practicing, because what you're doing is installing the patterns in your neurology to help you acquire the skill. If you try to practice too long and too intensely, you're going to, first of all, you get very tired. So you start making more mistakes. It's just, I've done a lot of recordings in recording studios in music, and we have to be very careful when we get the singer in, because there's only maybe a good hour left. Good hour in one person's voice where it's going to be coming across natural. And the same with any of the musicians. It's you go in, and after you've done 2 or 3 takes, it's not about whether you can get it right. It's about whether you can get the energy to perform the piece. So we've got lots of reference points out there, even I think in sport and that. But somehow when we get into the work environment, we sort of lose those reference points somehow, don't we? So how over the years, you've got a lot of experience. How does that happen?
That's a really interesting question. Just to go back to that practicing, though, just before we leave it. Yes, you need to practice. What you actually need to get is feedback. Now, if you're singing or playing guitar or whatever, you're getting that immediate feedback. Does that sound right? But in a context of something different, if you're just practicing but not getting feedback, you might be practicing wrong. And practice doesn't make perfect; it makes permanent. No. Yes. So I think it's important that you tie practice with feedback.
I think Anders Ericsson, who was the guy who was the source of the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell popularized, has pointed out that 10,000 hours of bad practice is not going to build skill, right? So anyway, now
10,000 hours is never sufficient to turn you into a genius, which is I think what the kind of the popular myth became. We could all become geniuses if we had 10,000 hours. No,
so some people acquire huge capability in half the time. It's just, it depends. Now, let's unpack this thing about how do we get from, there are so many reference points in the world that make sense around these things. And yet somehow when we walk in through the door of an organization, some of these wonderful reference points from the world around us seem to somehow get diluted or lost. What's your observation? How does that happen over the years? I mean, what have you seen happen in organizations where you kind of go in and look at their learning and development programs and think, how did you end up with this? Because, so anyway.
I think some of that comes down to context. And so, if you're learning guitar or to play football or whatever it is, out in the real world, there's a much stronger element of play. For a start, we play guitars, we play football. So there's a stronger element of play. There's a stronger element of it's okay to get it wrong. It's okay to make mistakes. And I think that's one of the pieces that has gone missing in some places in terms of organisations. That you have to get it right, because if you're not seen to get it right, you failed. That's where testing in terms of testing yourself, being able to recall stuff is really important. But testing where you get it right or you get it wrong is not helpful to learning at all.
No.
So I think we've got an element of the formality of it has stopped people playing, and the over testing has stopped people enjoying the learning experience because they're concerned about the testing and they're concerned about being seen to be wrong. I think a lot of it comes down to psychological safety. And, when you feel psychologically safe and you feel you're going to be supported whether you get it right or get it wrong, but you'll be supported onto, the next stage, then that's really powerful. And I think a lot of the time in formal learning, that psychological safety is not established. So people are looking around thinking, but if I get this wrong, I'm going to get into trouble, or, I will get a promotion or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and what if I don't?
The context is different. The context is so different that you don't recognise that it's a learning necessarily.
Yeah, and exercises and trainings, what if I can't do it, and stuff like that. And then you get separations as well, where in many cases, if you're working with a team of people, and learning and development doesn't have to be a training course. It has lots of different dimensions to it. If you're working with a team of people, and sometimes the leaders don't want to take part because, of course, they feel unsafe, or that they might be embarrassed because they run some sort of superiority idea in their head. And some organizations will call you in and say, for leaders, we only give them talks. We don't do trainings because there, you have to be careful with that level of people, and at the same time, in many organizations, people go on trainings, and one of the hands will go up and say, "Why is my boss not on this training?"
Yeah.
And when you work with a team is a system, and it's yes, maybe there's some hierarchy in it. At the same time, it's an interactive system. A system works on it's how the parts interact, which makes systems effective or not. And sometimes it's kind of strange, but I think it's like you say, the context. If it's a highly political environment, if it's an environment where mistakes are punished severely, and maybe even worse than that, they're tacitly punished. So it's just like nothing is said, but everything is said.
Yeah, people just look at you funny.
Yeah. No, I personally like to devote a certain amount of time, depending on how much time I have, at the beginning of a session with anybody, to check the psychological safety first. I need to find out to some degree how safe people actually seem to feel in this environment, and then I have to work on, if it's not strong, improving it, and sometimes adapting the training to such a way that if people are sensitive about things or seem to be a little bit scared of things, is to make sure that they never feel that they're on the spot. Some exercises have to be redesigned in one's head to make sure that it makes those people feel it's okay to be there.
And I really think this concept that senior leaders just need a briefing. Yes, they may need a briefing about what the training is about, but if they actually need to learn whatever it is themselves, their brains are no different to anybody, to the most junior person who only started last week. Their brains still need to process, they still need to experience in order to be able to learn. So I think this idea they should just they could have a taster maybe, but they still need to experience the learning for themselves in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, I mean, they have a specific role in the team anyway. And, this idea, I think it was Confucius once said, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. I mean, quality leaders I've met over the years will always say, I don't need to be the smartest guy or lady in the room. What I need to make sure is that I've got lots of smart people around me, and it's my job to bring out the best in those people. That type of person is not insecure in the room. They if they mess it up, they mess it up and laugh at it and say, I told you I'm not much good at this. That's why I've got you on my team. In the final part of our conversation, Stella provides us with valuable tips that we can start to use immediately. Into a few tips now. I'm thinking of, I suppose we can think of many different groups of people out there. There's HR people who buy in learning and development. There's trainers who deliver it. There's managers who say we need some of this training and development, or learning and development in our organization. And of course, then there's the ordinary person in the street. So if you could just maybe share a few. In terms of tips, I'd like it to be something that anybody could do just straight after this, listening to this podcast. They could go out and sort of try it out and experiment with it immediately and say, actually, that was a great piece of advice.
Okay, in terms of learning something.
Yeah.
Okay, I think first of all, get yourself motivated, understand why you ought to learn something. So keep that motivation in mind, because particularly if you're learning something that's a little bit complex, you're going to have some challenges, you're going to have some roadblocks. So understand why you're learning this thing and keep that in mind. What's the benefit to me of learning this thing? I think that's really important. Think about how you pay attention. So am I actually really paying attention to this? Because attention is the kind of the key into memory. So if you're trying to multitask, then you're going to really struggle with learning, because your brain is not processing, it's not focusing on what you need it to learn. I think the attention piece is important. If you've been given something to learn that's really boring, which does happen, we get boring documents we have to learn, we get boring processes we have to learn, we get on boring training courses that aren't really fulfilling our needs. Think about how you can use sort of stories and make that learning richer. How can you bring it to your needs? So one of the things I sometimes talk to people about in terms of memory is always link new learning to old learning. So what do I already know about this subject or this activity I want to do? What do I already know? What can I already do? And then link new stuff to that. That's really important. And make it emotionally relevant to you. So stories are so good. Things that are curious or novel. So can you find a way to make it curious for yourself? Can you find puzzles that you can solve? This is a really good way to make learning work. And I think, I've already talked about how easy it is to recognise something and not to recall it. I think, the power of repetition, you can't just learn something by doing it once. You have to repeat.
Yeah, because you have to create or strengthen or reorientate the connections and build that myelin sheath in the brain that'll keep it. And the fascinating thing about this, isn't it, Stella, that a lot of neuroscience research has been around this, has been helping people who've had strokes and other things really rehabilitate themselves and try to build new patterns in the brain to connect movement with what they want to do and their intention and that. And a lot of what we know is coming from, and that's at the very, those are the kind of very extreme sides of the equation. So we should all be capable of realizing that we can learn things, but we have to realize that it takes a bit of time, it takes effort. As you say, it takes repetition. And you won't do it if you're not motivated, if there's no what's in it for me. So in many ways, I guess anybody listening to this, I'm pretty sure now if you write something down on a piece of paper now about what you're trying to learn and just start thinking about what Stella's just told us, see about what's the motivation, what's the attention that you need to give that. Is it a little bit tedious or boring? Can you make it a bit more interesting for yourself? What do you know already? Yeah, that's great. Can you connect it to something you already know? That's going to give you a big leg up on that. And curiosity and a whole bunch of stuff like that. Now, how can an organization? So that's great. Now, how can organizational people who are looking at, you get these big budgets, right? So maybe you don't anymore, but you get these budgets to spend on training or learning and development. And we know it's not all about training, and it's not necessarily all about coaching. It's a sort of, there's a whole, why do we need to do this in the first place? But can you maybe transfer some of those great points to how to help people in organizations think differently about their learning and development, and then be able to express it and convince people using these principles to maybe reorientate the thinking around learning and development that doesn't seem to work very well?
So I think, we need to create an organisation in which learning is happening everywhere. And we've already talked about kind of the context, the psychological safety. So it has to be okay in the organisation to learn, to fail, to build, to try new things, to not be great at the start. But, if you learn to do something new, you're not going to be an expert from the beginning. So I think it's that kind of recognition, the journey. You have to take small steps and then grow. So I think that's really important. And I think, if you're trying to create a culture in your organisation where learning really happens, you have to get support from the top. So the top you've already talked about, you have to be the manager or, the CEO, whoever it is, has to be prepared to show that they're learning too and to support the learning process. Then I think if you can teach people how to learn, and we all learn naturally, but actually, we've talked about some of the myths that people have. We've talked about how it sometimes seems easier than it really is. But if you can teach people some really useful tips about how to learn, they are going to be able to develop faster, regardless of what they've done. And then the other piece is it's the squeeze middle. We know that we learn better, we learn more effectively when we've got support from managers or from peers or a mentor. So who else in the business is supporting that learning? So it's about kind of coming from top down, bottom up, and sideways, and creating a psychologically safe environment where learning is seen as normal, rather than it being just the formal part. And I think helping people recognise when they're learning from, people recognise learning when it's formal, I'm going on a training course. But a colleague and I have just had a conversation, and I learned something from him and he learned something from me, but it was just through a conversation and a little bit of experimentation on the internet. Now that was learning. But in order for that to stick as learning, we're both going to have to go back over that and reflect and think, now, what did we do? How did we do it? And how am I going to use it again?
Yeah. Even this process here, you're coming in on a piece of software that you hadn't used before. Yes. So now you have an experience of this. Whether it's something you would want to use again is another question. It just is part of these opportunities when we do something new, or tend to be learning opportunities. I was just thinking when you were talking there that you learning has to be sort of embedded as normal. I suppose this idea of making mistakes has to be also embedded as, we will make mistakes. That's just part of the way we're going to get better at things. And it's okay to make mistakes. Okay, at a certain point, if somebody keeps making the same mistake over and over again, somebody's going to
mistakes.
Yeah. So there has to be some boundaries and rules and guidelines on, whatever it is, 3 strikes or whatever they want to call it. And at the same time, if people don't make mistakes, that a basketball player who wants to shoot 100 baskets in a straight row is going to, at the beginning, miss 80 of them probably, and then they're going to get that number to come down till they get maybe, instead of missing 80, they get 80 to go in consistently. So once again, it's these reference points.
I think that's one of the things, that if you're continuously learning, you're always going to make mistakes, because you're always building on what you couldn't do before. So I think it's understanding that, yes, it's okay to make mistakes if you learn from them. It's not okay just to keep repeating them. But as an organisation, if somebody is continually repeating, you need to dig into why that's happening. Is it the learning that's wrong? Is it the motivation that's wrong? It's about asking questions around that.
Yeah. Okay, so we're getting close to the end. And what does the future look like for learning and development?
So I think we're going through a massive change in L&D at the moment. It's just fascinating. The whole kind of Corona thing has meant that everybody is now learning much more online. So I've got a real passion for supporting people to learn online, which goes beyond just let's just have lots and lots of Zoom calls or whatever it might be. How do we make that? How do we bring, as humans, we're multisensory. Our bodies evolved, our brains have evolved to take in more than just the 5 senses. There's many more than just our 5 senses. But, that's how we learn, by learning through our senses, the multiple senses we have. But when we're learning on Zoom or in a digital platform, we're not getting the same sensory input. So how can we build that in? How can we help to give people senses? And there's all sorts of things you can do there around, making it more colourful without being distracting. But also things like, the language we use. Can we make our language richer, more sensory? Can we encourage people to visualise a sensory experience? So they're actually getting that, that they're using their memory to create the future. And there is quite a strong belief that memory is only there to help us plan for the future. So how can we use those things to make digital learning much more engaging, and stop having, training by somebody talks at you and you listen too much and expect that to work. But engagement, interaction, doing. The learner has to do the doing.
Yeah, one of the great benefits of having to train over a Zoom or Teams, whatever you want to call it, whichever tool you're using, is that you have to stop showing slides, because once you show slides, you literally lose the audience unless you have multiple screens.
Yeah.
Unless you have multiple screens, you can lose your audience immediately. So that in itself has probably encouraged people delivering trainings to think about the need for PowerPoint, decks, and just throwing that content at people. So that can be one benefit. I've noticed the other benefit is that breakout rooms seem to work quite well. People, it's a bit of a relief to get out of the bigger environment, I think. Yeah. Also, when people get into those rooms, if you do it in a physical space, actually, people wander down the hall and it can take 10 minutes to set up the room and that. And I have found that even from a training point of view, I pop in and I often say, I might pop in. If you notice me, you notice me. If I think it's moving, I won't interrupt you because, it's just to make sure you're not stuck. Please take advantage of me if I'm there and ask me questions. I actually found that the people produce huge amounts of great stuff. It's quite impressive what they come out with.
Let the learners build on what they know, because they're already they're not in a training program to learn something they know nothing about. They've already got. They come with their own experience. Use that experience.
Yeah. Okay. And one actually great little learning I got, just taking what you've just been saying, I got from your book, which was fantastic, was, if you're doing multi-day trainings, or you have a gap between one session, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and often what trainers tend to do is they tend to do a recap, right? And one little trick that I'm pretty sure it was your book was, I send the people off and then they have to come back and teach me about the topic. And it's fantastic. It works so well because and as long as you let them do it in 2s and 3s, then they get that collective, nobody's put on the spot to remember everything. And at the same time, they get that bounce where they actually, and they get clarity, because now they have to figure out, not only can they remember it, now can they explain it to me in a way that I should be able to understand it. I have found that fantastic little technique.
And if you think about that in terms of the neuroscience, what they have to do is it's gone in once, so it's made some connections once. They've got to think about it so it's connecting again, because you've asked them to recall it. And then what they've got to do is to speak it out again in order to tell you or tell each other. So they're repeating that connection multiple times. So that's why it works. Whereas if you just tell them again, they may not even be paying attention.
So there's lots of great stuff like that in your book. And I will put some links in the show notes. And how else can people get in touch with you, Stella? How would you invite them to reach out to you?
They can connect with me on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, Stella Collins, easy to find. I'm also on Twitter, @Stella Collins, easy to find. And they can contact us through our website. So that's www.stellalabs.eu. And I'm very happy if people reach out if they're curious.
Well, I really, really enjoyed that conversation. And thanks so much for sharing all your wonderful insights and wisdom on this topic. And I hope that our listeners got a lot of value out of it. And go buy the book.
Happy learning, everybody.
Okay, Stella. Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. You will find details of what we covered in the show with links, etc. in the show notes. Please share your key takeaways from today's guest and let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast. Oh, and if there's a particular author or leading thinker you'd like me to interview, just get in touch and I'll do my best to get them on the show. This episode was brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Until next time.